Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Faisal Devji discusses the ongoing conflict in Palestine in the context of wider global transformations. This conversation was recorded on the 7th October, the day after the initial attack on Israel, and should be understood within this context.
We have seen something unprecedented happening in the Middle East. For the first time, apparently, we have had Palestinian groups linked to Hamas in the Gaza Strip attack and occupy Israeli settlements, take hostages, in the sure knowledge that they were inviting upon themselves the massed military might of the Israeli army. Now, I say this is unprecedented because, of course, it is in many ways. And yet, on the other hand, it isn't, because this set of actions, especially hostage takings, go back to the earliest days of the Palestinian resistance, days we thought we would never see again. That was a time in the 1960s and the 1970s when the Palestinian resistance served as a model for resistance movements around the world. It was by far the most important one globally. Whether it was the IRA in Northern Ireland, or the Red Brigades in Italy, or the Japanese Red Army faction, all of them referred to the PLO and affiliated groups linked to it as models of resistance, a word that continues to survive in parts of the world, but that has been expunged from the narratives of the liberal international order. So what do we see happening before us today? Is it a departure? Is it a return? And how are we to consider the history and the future of Palestinian resistance? Now, if there has been a gap of several decades between the resistance of the 1960s and the 1970s and what we see happening today, this, of course, has to do with two things. One, the end of the Cold War, which eliminated the political space that superpower competition had made possible for such movements. Not just the Palestinians, but the Red Army faction, the Red Brigades, and all the rest. Secondly, and as a result of the end of the Cold War, you have all such politics dragooned and maneuvered into a new kind of narrative, which has to do with absorption into the liberal international order, often, as in the case of Palestinians, by being shepherded through the agency of the United States government. So from Camp David to Oslo, you have the repackaging of the Palestinian movement as one that is now based not in the world at large, in the world of kidnappings and hijackings and hostage takings and spectacular attacks, but confined now largely to the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, newly constituted, and the Gaza Strip. These are movements now of governance. And governance is the crucial and the key term here because it was the post-Cold War term, a term that was seen as being an alternative to politics itself. All that is meant to happen here is governance. Of course, that was never entirely possible. And we have seen periodically a set of provocations on the one hand and uprisings on the other that have told everyone in the world that this struggle is not finished. But it has also looked increasingly grim. This is not what had happened in the 1960s and 70s, when the Palestinian movement seemed to be the forerunner of something global. Even as its struggle remains incomplete, it is still one that has come to be seen as sui generis, as peculiar, as restricted to its own very tiny territory. And in this way, the Palestinian struggle has also lost, I won't say credibility, but it has lost its kind of its international image. It is no longer what it used to be. Even as a regional issue, it often doesn't make it into the top 2 or 3 most important issues that face the Middle East. Today, of course, it is the most important issue, both in the Middle East and beyond it. And we shall have to see whether it continues being such or not. But the question I want to address today, the problem rather I want to address today, is whether the events of today really open up a new way of thinking about the struggle, and if resistance has returned to a new kind of life in the aftermath of these dramatic events. So long before today's events, Palestine had really ceased to be a point of reference internationally, apart from Kashmir. Kashmir, the struggle in Kashmir against India, was founded at the same time as the Palestinian struggle. Both emerged out of wars in 1948. And Kashmiris routinely refer to the Palestinian struggle as a model for their own, but no one else seems to. But others do appropriate the Palestinian struggle for themselves by making Palestinians followers of their models rather than the reverse. And the biggest example of this, of course, is the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So there is a link between anti-apartheid movements in South Africa on the one hand and internationally, and what's happening in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority and in the Gaza Strip. But that, in a way, is an illegitimate comparison, whatever the similarities involved, because it reduces the Palestinian struggle merely to a kind of epiphenomenon, a kind of remnant of a struggle that has already been concluded elsewhere. And when you look at the way in which the Palestinian struggle is viewed internationally, it tends to be in these ways, as a last surviving remnant, a fragment of something that has been nicely disposed of elsewhere in the world. It's like a delayed reaction, something that needs to happen, but that has no real originality of its own. And you see this, of course, in the invocations of Zionism as a settler colonial movement, therefore compared to the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, etc., as settler colonial movements, the setting up of those countries through settler colonialism. And you also see these comparisons made by reference to indigeneity, where it is the Palestinians' apparently prior settlement or origins in that territory that entitles them to its control or its ownership, or at least to be taken or seen as equals in that swath of territory that encompasses the Strip and the Bank and Israel itself. Now, the problem with these comparisons, apart from diminishing the modular role that Palestine had once played for resistance globally, is that they also put the Palestinian movement into a kind of uncomfortable and perhaps not very productive relationship of twinning with Zionism. So, if Zionism was a settler colonial project, it was also, of course, a nationalist movement, like the Palestinian movement in some ways. If the Palestinians make a claim to prior arrival and indigeneity, so do the Zionists, who refer to the Bible for this. And this intimacy of language, of political language, is really one that doesn't allow for the drawing of any clear line and therefore the making of any truly political relationship between the Palestinian movement on the one hand as a national movement and Zionism as another kind of national movement. It becomes a kind of bitty question of which one is preferable to the other, which one has committed more violence than the other. And you're not going to get a conceptually rich politics out of that kind of thing. But when you look back to the glory days of the Palestinian resistance in the 1960s and 70s, this is not the language that defined it. So think, for instance, of a book by the famous French novelist Jean Genet called The Prisoner of Love, which dealt, among other things, with his life in a Palestinian sort of resistance faction. And what was really interesting about that book, and this is simply one example out of many one could choose, is that distinctive about the Palestinian resistance, and arguably what made it into a global model, was the fact that there was no proportionality, no proportional relationship between the national movement for this very tiny space in the Levant, on the one hand, and on the other, the global arena of the resistance itself, with its hostage takings, its hijackings, its spectacular acts of violence and nonviolence, all of which were sacrificial. That is to say, those Palestinian militants who participated in these actions fully expected to be either killed or imprisoned, and their families perhaps to pay other kinds of prices for their activities. And it was this sacrificial element, which was globally dispersed, that really made, I believe, the Palestinian movement into a global model at the same time. Because it represented not simply a particular piece of territory, but a way of thinking and acting politically, one which focused on sacrifice rather than pure instrumentality, because the act of sacrifice, even when it is paired with violence, is one that makes an appeal, or that is meant to make an appeal, to illustrate the courage, the bravery, perhaps the martyrdom of the sacrificial militant, and in doing so to draw attention to his or her ability to make a statement that was not merely an instrumental statement. This is not a politics of contractuality. I do this, so you do that. It's a way of thinking politically that breaks existing narratives, that breaks liberal ideas of negotiation and contract, by creating a kind of spectacle that rearranges the relations of all parties concerned. So sacrifice is always a kind of appeal to one's own enemy, among others. This is the kind of thing that had made the Palestinian resistance into a global model. Now, that form of resistance, of course, has never ended. And you see it in quite everyday actions. Let's take, for example, the fact that when the Israeli army or air force is about to destroy a Palestinian house, which is meant to have given shelter to a militant or one of whose members, has been deemed to have gone over to the other side, they call up people living in that house and ask them to evacuate before the missile hits it. And it is now commonplace for ordinary Palestinians, not only those resident in the house, to actually clamber up onto the rooftop and lie there, inviting the missile to hit them. And it is a powerful act that appeals as much, if not more, to the Israeli pilot as it does to global public opinion, which doesn't actually seem to be much perturbed by it. This is the kind of sacrificial politics that seeks to break existing relationships and create a kind of moral imperative and not just an instrumental one. I'm going to resist you, but rather, can you allow yourself to question what you're doing? And that is all important in situations such as these. So that kind of sacrificial element hasn't and has never gone away from Palestinian politics. But it has increasingly been supplemented, if not displaced, by a more liberal model of thinking about relations in contractual terms. Now, this included not just the PLO's accession to Oslo, its return to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the creation of a Palestinian Authority, but also the promulgation of new forms of, if you will, liberal kinds of resistance. Interestingly, only, as far as I'm aware, in the West. So in Europe, Western Europe, and in North America. Crucial here is the BDS movement: boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Now, it's a contradictory movement because, on the one hand, it inherits the sacrificial imperative of the old resistance movement, which depended upon, as I said earlier, the disproportionate relationship between a national movement and a small territory on the one hand, and the global arena of operations with its sacrificial actions and its claim for universal responsibility on the other. We are all responsible for what is happening in that small place, the militants seem to be saying, and their actions were actions of agents, not of victims, even as they were sacrificial in nature. So the BDS movement, though it has shrunk in comparison to the old forms of resistance of the 1960s and 70s, it has shrunk to the West. It doesn't even seem to be particularly interested in other parts of the world. Nevertheless, inherits some of that sacrificial imperative, insofar as its proponents suffer disproportionately. They are targeted, they are trolled, they are banned, they are fired, and laws are passed in various Western countries to ban BDS. In that sense, they are part of the old struggle. But in another sense, they are not, because they appeal to a logic of sanctions that is crucial to and fundamental to the international liberal order. Now, sanctions, of course, come out of imperialism. They come out of the days of 19th century gunboat diplomacy and blockades. And they seem to have been introduced into international law after the First World War, when these colonial practices were brought back to Europe, by Britain in particular, because they tend to be maritime practices rather than territorial ones. And of course, sanctions disproportionately target civilians and continue to do so. Today, sanctions are primarily associated with the United States, and though they come out of the structure of international law, they have become increasingly unilateral. So the United States no longer needs the approval of the United Nations to impose sanctions, and third-party sanctions at that, on anyone it chooses. It simply does so. So sanctions are a very interesting set of practices. They presume contract, that there is a set of laws, there are contractual relations between the parties to these laws, normally nation states, but also political parties. And those who violate the law need to be sanctioned and therefore punished. So sanctions are punitive measures, and they presume the existence of an international order and of states. So when ordinary people, whether it's academics or social activists in Western Europe and North America, adopt this language to promote and propound the Palestinian cause, they're actually hooking into a pre-existing imperial and, if you will, liberal international language. They are speaking in the name of a state, even though the state does not exist, Palestine. Or they're speaking in the name of the international order, even though the international order as it exists is not saying the things that they're saying, or no longer saying the things that they're saying. They seem to be acting in the name of a state or an international order to punish Israelis or Zionists or those who support them. But they do so, of course, in a way that is fragmentary at best. It certainly raises consciousness of the issues in North America and in Western Europe, but the blowback of these actions is very severe. And it is what gives these figures a kind of nobility. And yet, as I say, their actions are quite contradictory because they refer to the state system and an international order that has been primarily responsible for the oppression and the circumstances and the conditions, all very bad, under which Palestinians live. Now, it could, of course, be true that you can't have one without the other, that you have to have both a kind of sacrificial politics, which appeals to the enemy as a potential friend, and which breaks existing relations, and which doesn't depend on contractual ideas and punishment for violations of such contracts. And you also need the other liberal script, which I have otherwise been criticizing. These two certainly come together in BDS in a very interesting way. But today's events in Palestine and Israel might actually have done a great deal to separate them out again. Because these actions, while they may eventually result in a language of negotiation and contract and liberalism, at the moment don't do any of these things. They have broken through the crust of that internationalist narrative, which has been the only one possible since the end of the Cold War. And so we might, in fact, be seeing the return of something else, something that has been long repressed, something that we never thought perhaps we would see emerge. Or it may, in fact, be the case that this will be yet another upsurge, perhaps temporary. And yet, of course, it can never be temporary in one sense, because it has shown up both the abilities and the capacities of one set of actors in a very tiny piece of land, a strip, and the incapacity or the inability of another set of actors, the Israeli military, just next door, who seem to have been unaware of these very deep and clearly long laid plans. Now, the other factor here which moves this set of events into another world has to do with regional geopolitics. That the actors involved are no longer the same. We are no longer talking about Israelis and Palestinians as triangulated through the United States, which these are the three actors who have been with occasionally an Arab state or two involved in a subordinate manner. Today we see something very different because, of course, one of the things these attacks have made clear is that they have put paid for the moment to the idea of a Saudi-Israeli normalization. Maybe of some comfort to Iran, which may or may not have had anything to do with these events. But it certainly helps the Iranian cause in the region. So whether Palestine has become simply an agent of another kind of struggle is not clear. They're certainly agents in the fact that they have manufactured and engaged in these events and initiated them. But these events are also, I'm pointing out, part of another logic, which is no longer the logic of Camp David and of Oslo. It is no longer the logic of international law and contract. It is about breaking something. It's about breaking that logic and breaking that narrative and ushering something new into the world. And it might well be the case, therefore, that what we saw locked together in BDS, the sacrificial element and the contractual element, have come apart again in a way last seen in the 1970s and the 1960s. Something new and something old. And we shall have to see where we go with this. While we don't know quite exactly what's going to happen in the aftermath of these events, there will clearly be more violence and more victims created. But I think one of the really interesting outcomes of this set of attacks, and let's name them for what they are, is that they emphasize the agency of Palestinians. These are not just responses, though, of course, you can say they are responses to prior acts of violence by the Israelis, but they are not direct responses. They are initiatives. They display political agency, whether you approve of it or not. And what is important here is that in initiating this violence, even if they are responding to structures of violence that pre-exist, what Palestinian militants are also doing is repudiating the language of victimhood, which is crucial to the liberal script and to liberal internationalism. For them, only victims are legitimate actors. Victims, of course, have no moral status otherwise. This is something that anti-colonial movements had recognized a long time ago. To be a victim is to have no moral status at all. You might feel sorry for victims, but much as the liberal script desires their existence, what anti-colonial movements always focused on was agency, moral agency, and therefore political agency as well. What today's events have done is to foreground the role of moral and political agency rather than of victimhood. Victimhood was always the form that hovered over movements like BDS. And it is a form that is deeply violent. Not only does it displace agency from the victim to the, if not the perpetrator, the savior, the United Nations as a savior, the United States as a savior, liberal individuals and societies as saviors, but in doing so, it condemns the victim to a life of humiliation or to a sense of humiliation as someone who has no agency. And humiliation can only result in violence in the future, in the violence of retribution, in the violence of revenge, in the violence of self-hatred. This is something that someone like Gandhi used to elaborate on at considerable length. So what today's events have shown us is not only the separation of the liberal script with its focus on contract on the one hand, and the moral and political script with its focus on sacrifice on the other, but also it has foregrounded, or rather they have foregrounded, agency, both moral and political, over victimhood. Now, the first phase of Palestinian resistance had as its context the Cold War. It was made possible by bipolar conflict. And once the Cold War ended, the Palestinian resistance ended as well, or at least it ended as a globally dominant phenomenon. Today, we see another post-Cold War world emerging. Some people think it's a new Cold War. Whatever it is, the alignment of political actors has changed to a degree that it is no longer possible to continue the liberal mode of Palestinian politics. Or at least it's no longer possible to have that liberal mode be the dominant one. Because we now live in a world, certainly after the war on terror, after the defeat of the West in Afghanistan, and after the inauguration of the Ukraine war, in which the United States is unable to control even its own allies and sometimes even its own clients. The Turks are bombing American allies in Syria. the Iraqis are cutting the slack of American allies, Kurdish allies in Iraq. Indians and Pakistanis, Emiratis, Qataris are doing all kinds of things which they would never have done in the past vis-a-vis the United States and other Western powers. And it is this new world which has allowed space for the reemergence of Palestinian resistance. This is no longer the triangular world of Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans that had held that struggle in place since the end of the Cold War. That world is gone. And it is this new world that now defines not just the Palestinian struggle, but every other struggle, form of resistance, and political movement that we see around us today.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.